Welcome to the final part of my Dark Crystal review. Last time I praised the movie's rich world building. A lot of effort was put into depicting a unique environment and alluding to a deep history. Although it seems Jim Henson's focus on world building was so strong, it actually interfered with other important aspects of the movie. For example,
So immersed was Jim in this world he was creating, in fact, that he had asked screenwriter David Odell not to write any dialogue for the Skeksis or Mystics. Instead, he wanted his creatures to speak a language all their own, making the film even sound otherworldly. Jim was confident the film's visuals were strong enough to clearly convey the plot and carry the story. While he and Jewel were still in London working on Fraggle Rock, Jim had excitedly asked the two of them to watch one of the first segments he had edited together, the enormous and loud Skeksis banquet scene that Jim absolutely loved. Afterward, Frith walked down to the reception area where Jim was slouched down on a sofa, hands folded across his stomach, waiting for Frith's verdict. "Jim, there's one thing I just have to say," Frith began slowly. "I have no idea what the scene was about. You've got to have them talk, or at least give them subtitles." There was nothing to do but go back and redub the entire movie with English dialogue.
this may be why the mystic leader gives such scant details about the prophecy. They could only match so much exposition to the mouth flaps. Beyond the alien languages, this enormous focus on the world detracted from the development of story and characters.
Rather than trying to develop a story first, never Jim's strongest suit, he was more interested in fleshing out the underlying concept, as well as the look and feel of the world and the characters inhabiting it.
The Gelflings are a good example of early creature development that was carried out by all of the creature groups prior to the development of the story, which is just the reverse of what normally is done in a film. Out of the creature development grew a story that Jim had formulated and on into a screenplay by David Odell.
He knew his preoccupation with the look of the film meant he was approaching the project in an unconventional, almost backward way. 6 months later, there was still no real script to speak of, but in the summer of 1979, Jim flew to New York to pitch the crystal to executives at Paramount anyway. But typical of Jim's approach to the project, the pitch book for the crystal devoted most of its space to the characters and the world itself. That left just half a page to outline the story, only vaguely described as a struggle through terrible dangers and hardships. The mixed response was typical. "The Dark Crystal really polarized opinion," said Brian Henson. "People who liked it loved it, but others were not so keen." Generally, though, the reaction from moviegoers was a disinterested shrug. "I find that often the most effective things we do are simple," Jim had once said, "and that elaborate production does not always add to the entertainment value of the film." That was the biggest problem with The Dark Crystal. For the first time, Jim had let spectacle get in the way of the story. His vision had come first, the story second.
I think this is why Jen comes off as such a wet sausage of a character. With Kira, they utilize her connection to nature and wildlife to characterize her. She is empathetic to all living things, with a kind, friendly demeanor. This leads to deep care for others and the selfless desire to help, driving her to rash action and self-sacrifice. Jen comes from a closed-off academic background, yet this isn't utilized to the same extent. It rarely comes into play beyond his general inexperience and his ability to read. The writers might have benefited from expanding on this. For example, let's say the mystics taught Jen to think methodically, giving him an affinity for problem-solving and an extensive knowledge of the past. This might make him good at deciphering clues, but susceptible to overthinking things and putting reason before moral intuition. There are hints of this characterization throughout the movie. Jen is able to read the writing in the ruins. He actually considers making a deal with Chamberlain, despite him being a creature of evil and cruelty. When they catch up to the captured podlings, Jen is more inclined to hang back and observe. However, these examples are few and far between. Most of the time, Jen stumbles around, not knowing what he's supposed to do, relying on luck to get him from point A to B. He was lucky they stumbled upon the ruins. He was lucky to have Kira provide transportation. He was lucky there was an entrance into the castle at the bottom of that cliff. He was lucky he found the crystal room before the Skeksis saw him. And he was lucky Kira got him the shard in time to fulfill the prophecy. For most of the movie, Jin is either confused as hell or simply does what he's told. He doesn't even have a strong reason to go on this journey in the first place. His master says he has to, so he does. The Skeksis killed his parents, but he never seems motivated by this. Jen shapes up to be a dull character, lacking in motivation and personality, especially compared to Kira, whose every action is strongly driven by personal wants. And while we're on the topic of characters, I should go over Chamberlain and Agra. Chamberlain is the Skeksis that gets the most characterization. He lusts for status and power, so at the start of the story, he makes a grab at becoming emperor. However, he loses to the general, and is cast out. During the rest of the movie, Chamberlain uses cunning and scheming to claw back all that he lost. At the start, the position of emperor is decided by a test of strength. It's a barbaric metric to choose a leader, entirely discarding wisdom, intelligence, and other important traits. However, it's still an honest competition. As such, Chamberlain loses. He's weak and can't win honestly. It's only through deception and manipulation, playing upon the desires of the other Skeksis, that he's able to succeed.
Moldy mildew, mother of mouse muck, dangle and strangle.
Agra is less well put together. She's confusing. She's both invested in Jen's fulfillment of the prophecy, but also strangely unhelpful to him. She gives him some information, though arbitrarily decides not to give him the whole story until later. She gives him the crystal shard needed to heal the dark crystal, but wastes his time making him guess which one it is. She encourages Kira, helping her escape, and directs Jen so they can be reunited, but then she just sits on her ass, not doing anything. The movie wants Agra to be an ambivalent entity, but it also needs her to help Jen and Kira. So she sits in this uncomfortable middle ground, where she lends them aid, but not as much as she reasonably should. The other Skeksis don't get much character outside of being greedy and cruel, and the Mystics don't really get anything. It's a shame, because Jim Henson clearly cared a lot about these characters, thinking of many ideas for each individual's personality and role. For example, the mystic Urim, the healer, has the ability to restore balance to the... The movie plays with hefty themes, dealing with ideas of duality and interconnectedness. The Skeksis and the Mystics are two halves of a whole, the evil and the good that exist in each of us. The world can only be righted when these two aspects unite.
The idea was that this kingdom had been fractured and the good and the evil had been separated out. And the story was about integrating the two back into single characters.
Indeed, the end of Dark Crystal is, integrating the dark and the light.
This is because both are necessary parts of being a whole person.
In our idea of them being split up, we were saying, but one is not better than the other. They both have their strengths and they both have their weaknesses.
The Skeksis, as symbolically evil, are consumed by vile traits. Their rule leads to decay and death. This is fairly obvious. What's more difficult is pinpointing their benefits, as well as the fatal flaw that exists in the Mystics.
Jim's concept for the Mystics was they were very holy and spiritual, and they had purged themselves of all their bad lower selves, but this meant that they were incapable of really acting in the world, that you have to have some little tinge of bad impulses in order to create. I mean, power implies some sort of aggressiveness, and you can't really act in the world without having a little bit of Skeksis in you.
The Mystics have confined themselves to this valley of theirs, where they repeat the same rituals over and over.
A dying race, numbly rehearsing the ancient ways in a blur of forgetfulness.
They are wise but slow creatures, unable to pursue action. Kind of. The problem is they do act in the world. They raise Jen for the purpose of fulfilling the prophecy, and they journey out of their valley to take part in the merging with the Skeksis. It's because of the mystics that this story occurs. They're just strangely selective about what they'll say and do. This theme would have read better if the mystics truly were incapable of acting in the world. For example, let's say that Jen learns about the prophecy on his own, then sets out to fulfill it based on his own wishes. And then, the mystics remain in their valley. They don't journey to the crystal at all. The merging occurs regardless of their actions. Now the theme works better, though the mystics become much more boring. I suspect this was a problem they were grappling with anyway. Throughout the movie, we briefly cut to the mystics, walking towards the castle. These moments add nothing, other than to remind the audience that the mystics exist. This is necessary because of the pivotal role they play in the finale. However, because of their nature, there isn't anything interesting to see them do.
My hand!
The connections between the Skeksis and the mystics were also taken into account with regards to character design.
Of course, the secrets that we discovered in this movie is that the Skeksis and the mystics are two aspects of the same creature. So I had to design them anatomically in a similar way. Their skull structure is the same, so when they conjoined, you do feel that they were part of the same creature. So my challenge is to give them, their counterparts, some reference to each other. They have to be seemingly totally different and totally separate, and yet they are inextricably linked. So there had to be some anatomy going on underneath that told you that they were the same thing. You didn't need to know right at the beginning, but you needed to know later on.
This also extends to background design details.
You can begin to notice now as we move into the chamber. There are the symbols that we've been seeing in the Mystic Valley, also seen in a different form here in the castle. Chamberlain is holding a scepter, and there's this sort of hooked-like thing. Now, the idea behind this symbolism is that there's this symbol, which is the Ouroboros, which is a serpent that swallows its own tail. And this is a symbol of renewal. The Skeksis have cut through this now. There is no renewal. They've broken the circle. It's a perversion of something that was once beautiful. And we have a duplicate of this that was in the background of the mystic when it dies, which was a softer version of it. But it was just another little clue that these creatures are connected. And what needs to happen is that circle needs to be joined up.
For the most part, this duality between the Skeksis and the mystics works, provided you ignore any unfortunate implications.
But Frith thought the plot was awful. Dark Crystal was a story about genocide, Frith exclaimed, shaking his head even 30 years later. And what you're saying is that you can extirpate an entire race of people, and then, because the stars come together right, suddenly you've become some godlike figure, and everything's okay.
When you frame these events like that, it does bring up a moral quandary. But context changes this radically. Look at it this way. Is it morally justified to kill the Skeksis? They are responsible for enslaving podlings and murdering gelflings, among other heinous acts. I doubt many would argue against the Skeksis deserving death. So, if you want to look at the merging of the Skeksis and the mystics as them dying, it isn't necessarily morally unjustified. As for the mystics, they appear to be going through with this process entirely willingly. When you look at their unification from that perspective, it becomes overly simplistic to call it genocide. Sorry, Frith, but I gotta disagree. Beyond the mystics and the Skeksis, the movie has a broader theme about how all things in the world are interconnected. Everything has a push and pull. Nothing can act in a vacuum.
Jim wanted something that was about connection. He really believed that we were all connected and needed to help each other. This has a mystical aspect that's very Jim Henson. This indicates some of his philosophy about everything in it is connected. That's why when I designed it, I'd put all this symbols and geometry in. Everything, including the creatures, have symbolism. And it says that everything in this world is interconnected, that everybody needs to rely on each other, and every single element of this world is important.
And it is this theme that I think somewhat clashes with the previous. If you remember, part of the duality between the Skeksis and the Mystics is the idea that the Mystics are incapable of acting in the world. And as I explained, that's untrue. The story only occurs because of their interference, and the theme of all things being connected supports this. A lot of evidence for this theme can be found in background and design details.
You'll spot some symbols in the background, and they relate to castle and to the Skeksis. Everything interconnects. Rays of light are about connection. Let's say everything in the world is connected. The geometry does that, but here you see the geometry. It's geometry of light. Now we finally get to understand my design of why the shapes are the way they are, because they can actually fit together.
Plot-wise, there's the unification of the Skeksis and the Mystics to contribute to this theme. But there's another aspect of the story that I think also supports this idea. There is one line from the Urskeks with interesting implications.
Hold her to you. She is part of you, as we all are part of each other.
This is something I've alluded to throughout this review. The prophecy tells of two becoming one. The crystal and the shard become one. The Skeksis and the Mystics become one. I think you can also read the union of Jen and Kira as something similar. Bear with me. I believe Jen represents the archetypal masculine, while Kira represents the archetypal feminine. And it's only with the two united that prosperity can be attained.
With puppets, a puppet generally you're working symbolically. A puppet is a symbol of whatever you're trying to portray.
Jen comes from an academic background. He's inherited the language of his ancestors and the rituals of the Mystics. These practices typically symbolize the masculine. Culture is the father figure, passing down the wisdom of his father and his father's father, giving the world structure. Kira is connected with Mother Nature, and she is an empathetic, compassionate person. These aspects typically symbolize the feminine. The nurturing of potential is the mother figure, bringing new life into the world and encouraging it to grow, opening up the world to unlimited possibilities. These patterns are also in their upbringings. Jen was raised by the Mystics, wise men repeating the same rituals over and over within the confines of their valley. They are order, masculine. Kira was raised by the Podlings.
We originally conceived the pod people as being very much part of the earth itself, so we based them literally on potatoes.
A wild people with the ability to communicate with the growing and shifting natural world. They are chaos, feminine. And it's only with the union of order and chaos, the union of the masculine and feminine, that meaning and prosperity can be produced. That's what the common symbol of yin and yang alludes to, this balance. You see, both aspects are shown to have their strengths and weaknesses. Jen, as the symbol of the masculine, has inherited knowledge that provides utility. For example, he can read Gelfling writing, letting him gain information about the prophecy from his ancestors. He's also learned certain rituals from the Mystics, which proves useful in finding the crystal shard. However, Jen has been confined to the strict borders of the valley all his life. He doesn't know what lies beyond, so his journey is fraught with hardship. The environment is foreign and hostile, and Jen quickly becomes frustrated and confused. As someone confined to the domain of order, he becomes basically useless as soon as he steps into the domain of chaos. Kira, as the symbol of the feminine, is highly attuned to nature. Unlike Jen, she thrives in the wilderness, the domain of chaos, and uses this, along with her great empathy, to gain the aid of the animals and navigate them through the wild. However, this strong empathy gets her in trouble. It causes her to act rashly when her loved ones are in danger, and being raised in the wilderness has disconnected Kira with her ancestors. She's unable to read the Gelfling writing and fears the ruins. It's only by working together can Jin and Kira utilize their strengths and cover for each other's weaknesses, thus fulfilling the prophecy and restoring the world. Now, this assessment isn't without some problems. Jin and Kira don't fit into these archetypes perfectly. For example, as the symbol of the masculine, Jin possesses knowledge of his ancestors, except when he doesn't. It's Kira that knows about Gelfling physiology, such as the concept of dream fasting and the differences between male and female Gelfling. You could argue this still fits, as Gelfling biology would still fall under the domain of nature, but I still feel this muddles the metaphor a bit. Even so, I think they align close enough for this to be a meaningful theme, especially since it fits in so well with the overarching idea of interconnectedness. Overall, The Dark Crystal has some big writing issues. The story is confused, relying on contrivance and arbitrary character decisions to push the plot forward. Jen is the weakest of the primary characters, which sucks, as he's the main character and the audience's eyes into this world. On the other hand, there are consistently written characters with storytelling that does work in some regards. The movie contains strong themes that mostly hold up to scrutiny, and the movie excels in its world building. So, a real mixed bag that I personally have a lot of love for.